Welcome to Representation and Recovery, the second phase of the ADE annual conference, for which registration is free. I am Noelle Baker, Chair of the Program Committee and President of the ADE. Beginning today, each Tuesday in July, we'll showcase some exceptional presentations, and I look forward to listening and learning from the ensuing conversation. Let us hear from you during session Q&A and on Twitter with the hashtag #DocEdit21. Live sessions will be made available on Zoom, and recordings, where permitted, will appear on the ADE's YouTube channel about a week later. This session is recorded. And now we begin. Jennifer?
Thanks, Noelle. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Noelle noted, the session is being recorded, and if you have questions, please share them in the chat, and if we have time at the end, we will share them with the presenter. My name is Jennifer Sturzer, and I am the Director of the Center for Digital Editing and the Washington Papers at the University of Virginia. I'm very excited and honored to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Roopika Risam, who will be giving the keynote address entitled Beyond the Blacklist, Reanimating Intersectional Feminist Media Histories. Professor Risam is Chair of Secondary and Higher Education and Associate Professor of Education in English at Salem State University. She also serves as the Faculty Fellow for Digital Library Initiatives, Coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Studies, and coordinator of the combined BA, MED in English education. Professor Risam's first monograph, New Digital Worlds, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Practice, and Pedagogy, was published by Northwestern University Press. She is co-editor of Intersectionality and Digital Humanities and South Asian Digital Humanities, Post-Colonial Mediation Across Technology's Cultural Canon. Risam's latest co-edited collection, The Digital Black Atlantic, and the Debates in the Digital Humanities series was published in 2021. Her current book project, Insurgents, Academics, A Radical Account of Public Humanities, which traces a new history of public humanities through the emergence of ethnic studies, is under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. Her scholarship has appeared in Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, Digital Humanities Quarterly, Debates in the Digital Humanities, First Monday, Popular Communications, College and Undergraduate Libraries, and the Native American and Indigenous Studies, among other journals and volumes. Professor Risam's work building humanities knowledge infrastructures has been supported by grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, Mass Humanities, and the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. She is currently developing the Global Du Bois, a data visualization project on W.E.B. Du Bois. She also co-directs Reanimate, an intersectional feminist publishing collective that recovers archival writing by women in media industries, and co-hosts the project Rocking the Academy. She is also a founding member of the Data Sitters Club and co-editor of Reviews in Digital Humanities. Currently co-vice president of the Association for Computers and the Humanities, Risam previously served as a founding board member of the Global Outlook Digital Humanities. She also received the Massachusetts Library Association's inaugural Civil Liberties Champion Award for her work promoting equity and justice in the digital cultural record. Risam's research interests lie at the intersections of post-colonial and African diaspora studies, humanities knowledge infrastructures, and digital humanities. Risam explains that at the heart of her research is the concern that while digital knowledge production has accelerated rapidly in the last few decades, the exclusions and biases that have long shaped print culture, products of colonialism, racism, and patriarchy, are being reproduced and amplified as we construct the digital cultural record of humanity. Risam states that representation alone will not address these issues. Therefore, her scholarship examines the methodologies, reward structures, labor models, and ethics of research necessary for more fully realizing the promise of knowledge production in the digital age. As we all think about our own projects and consider the implications of our decision-making, from methodology and selection to presentation and discoverability, Risam's work challenges us to not only think about these issues, but to become active participants in creating ethical, representative, and deeply collaborative humanities knowledge infrastructures and outputs. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Risam.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your introduction. And thank you to Noelle and the conference organizing committee for the opportunity to speak with you today, and to all of you for being here. I am going to talk today about the role of the digital edition as a tool of cultural recovery, contextualizing it as a contribution to post-colonial and feminist digital humanities, and do this through my experiences working with digital editions. More broadly, my scholarship is grounded in the belief that digital humanities holds tremendous promise for revolutionizing the digital cultural record of humanity. As Jerome McGann suggests in his 2014 book, A New Republic of Letters, it's a truth now universally acknowledged that the whole of our cultural inheritance has to be recurated and re-edited in digital forms and institutional structures. Digital humanities has indelibly shaped our digital cultural record, as well as the labor structures that support it, bringing together collaborations of faculty, librarians, graduate students, as well as practitioners in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums to transform the print cultural record into what I call the digital cultural record. But as I argue in my first book, New Digital Worlds, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy, we need greater attention to both the socio-historical conditions surrounding the creation and emergence of knowledge, and the ways that this knowledge, even in mediated digital forms, continues to be marshaled to the exclusion of communities that have historically been marginalized and that continue to be today, whether because of race, gender, sexuality, colonialism, migration, diaspora, or a combination of these factors. Therefore, our responsibility is to re-examine humanities research practices and to challenge the ways that the exclusions and biases that have characterized print culture, which, as Jennifer noted in the introduction, I position as products of patriarchy, racism, and colonialism, are not only reproduced, but are being amplified as digital knowledge production has accelerated rapidly over the last few decades. And this is really critical because we're at a moment when publics are looking primarily to digital sources for information. And we have the responsibility to ensure that what they find isn't just the narratives that reproduce the literary and cultural canons that determine whose stories are worth preserving, but instead ones that shed light on voices that have for too long gone unheard. So in my book, I position post-colonial digital humanities as an approach to uncovering and intervening in the disruptions within the digital cultural record that are produced by colonialism and neocolonialism. And at its heart, post-colonial digital humanities is an exercise in world making, because it foregrounds the use of digital humanities scholarship to create new models for knowledge. It navigates between the ways that the world has been shaped by colonialism and the models of the world instantiated by digital knowledge production in the humanities. So in doing so, post-colonial digital humanities calls attention to and offers redress for the colonial dimensions of world making that appear in the production of digital humanities scholarship. Now, humanities knowledge has long been understood as a form of world making. Nelson Goodman argues that the human universe is comprised of a plurality of worlds that emerge from multiple sources, including the processes that subtend humanities and scientific knowledge production. As scholars, including Jean-Luc Nancy, Feng Chia, and Henrique Dussel, have proposed, colonialism is itself a world-making project, reflected in and constructed through a variety of methods, from the maps that outline the shape of the world, to the link between textuality and the production of colonial discourse, and also the legal, juridical, and political apparatuses that produce ideological conditions for a colonial world. And this is accompanied by the process of worlding, which scholars like Guthrie Spivak and Ijaz Ahmad have argued as the othering of worlds that are subject to colonial domination and control over representation over the global South, whose denizens are rendered subaltern through articulations of colonial discourse. The worlding of the cultural record is crucial for us because it has in turn facilitated the worlding of the digital cultural record. Given the role of knowledge production in world making, digital humanities can be understood as a world making project as well. And I think Matthew Kirschenbaum articulates this really well in his controversial article, Hello Worlds, which argues that humanities students should learn how to code. He describes programming as a unique and startling way of looking at the world, in fact, a kind of world making. For Kirschenbaum, the coder becomes the world maker, charged with defining the rules and characteristics of the world, articulating the behaviors of an object or a system from the ground up. This apt description of programming evinces the colonial dynamics of knowledge production, akin to Edward Said's contention that Orientalist scholarship almost invented the Orient for Europe. Kirschenbaum's description of world making also evokes the processes of knowledge creation that we undertake when we produce digital editions. He argues that programming is about choices and constraints, and about how you choose to model some select slice of the world around you in the formal environment of the computer. The world making of programming for Kirschenbaum is intimately linked to producing humanities knowledge. In defining world, he is careful to distinguish between the world of the program and the world around us, a representation of reality where some elements of the real are emphasized and exaggerated, others are distorted and caricatured, still others are absent altogether. The same is true of digital knowledge production, where digital editions selectively represent human knowledge and culture through a range of interpretation. This definition of world enacts a slippage between the world of the model and the lived world. And it produces a liminality in which we can imagine digital editions gaining new footing as they remake worlds that are unmoored from the real. Therefore, world making in the digital edition fosters the proliferation of many worlds, reflecting what Kirschenbaum describes as how reality can be sliced and sampled in an infinite variety of ways. Now, this raises the question, however, of whether these worlds are reproducing the hegemonies of the so-called real world and whether other worlds are possible. As such, the world making of the digital edition and of digital humanities more generally conjures the world making of the colonial project. These acts of world making include the physical dimensions of colonialism, so the settler colony, maps, colonial archives, as well as the intangible aspects, new legal systems, literature, colonizing of the mind. A cornerstone of modernity, colonialism has built our contemporary world. But one step further, it has created the ways we know the world. And in response, I like to think about the practices that we must engage in digital humanities as exploring the practices needed to create new worlds that challenge the centrality of the dominant white, male, heterosexual, cisgender culture, both in the cultural record and in digital humanities scholarship. Think about how we can decenter the hubs of capital in the production of models of knowledge and engage with the liminal, the abject, the subaltern, the overlooked, by placing them at the center of inquiry in the digital cultural record. As models of the physical world, virtual worlds can provide iterative ways of accessing and understanding the world around us as they co-construct and co-constitute it. But will these worlds be ones that reaffirm dominant cultural values and knowledge hierarchies, or will they be ones that imagine new forms of resistance through digital knowledge production? These are the questions that are before us as we think about the work of editing. Certainly, representation is a key dimension of this work. Inclusion of unheard voices and untold stories through the production of the digital edition is critical to ensuring greater accessibility to these stories, as well as their potential for use in other digital research methods like computational textual analysis. Of course, the presence and absence of material in the cultural record itself influences the extent to which digital representation is possible. And we will always be haunted by the absences, by the material that was not thought to be worth preserving, the material that has been hidden, and the material that we can't even imagine. Textual editing has a crucial role to play in this work of representation. And in my own work, I've explored the possibilities of this methodology. Literature of the African diaspora is one area where digital textual recovery has a long history of making the kinds of contributions to diversifying the digital cultural record for which I'm advocating. As Amy Earhart notes in her excellent book, Traces of the Old, Uses of the New, The Emergence of Digital Literary Studies, scholars of African American literature embraced the emerging internet culture of the 1990s to recover texts by African American writers. While some of these projects, like the Charles Chestnut Archive, still exist, many of these early projects have been lost because they were not preserved and sustained. With the advent of new methods, however, a number of older projects have been revived, like Mariama Graham's project on the history of Black writing. And new initiatives have emerged as well, like the Black Press Research Collective, directed by Kim Gallen. In fact, my very first digital humanities project was a critical digital edition of Claude McKay's poetry collection, Harlem Shadows, with Chris Forster at Syracuse University. While McKay's work is well known, and therefore this edition is not a work of recovery per se, the experiences that led to our work on the edition highlighted for me some of the crucial ways that digital editions can intervene in the challenges to the presence of Black writers in the digital cultural record. While we were both in graduate school, Forster and I each had moments while teaching that ultimately led to this project. As a teaching assistant at the University of Virginia, this was in the late 2010s, Forster had an experience where he found that Amazon was selling cheap, crappy versions of McKay's Harlem Shadows because it was public domain and therefore there for the taking for anybody who wanted to print it on demand and sell it. And around the same time, I was a teaching assistant at Emory University, and I had assigned James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. And my students went and bought the cheapest versions that they could find, also on Amazon. And there was this moment while we were discussing the novel in class, and we realized that one of the versions that many of the students had bought was actually missing more than an entire chapter of the book. And it was this sort of awkward moment where one student referenced an incident that happened while the character was traveling in Florida. Another student said, that never happened. Chaos ensued. And when we started digging deeply into what was going on, we discovered that, again, it was like Forster's discovery. It was a print-on-demand publishing operation on Amazon that was simply reproducing extant and sometimes inaccurate texts and public domain, just taking public domain texts, slapping a cover on them, printing them and selling them. No quality control whatsoever. And the great tragedy and irony of this was that writers of the Harlem Renaissance, like Claude McKay, like James Weldon Johnson, were writing to claim their humanity and make the case through their capacity to produce art for their incorporation into the putative democratic space of the nation. And 100 years later, this invaluable work is circulating through poorly produced editions purely for profit. So based on this experience, Forster and I decided that maybe there was something we could do about this. We began working on the Harlem Shadows project as an experiment in whether there was a way to quickly create digital editions of public domain texts to make them more useful for teaching. And the answer, at least to the quickly part, was no, but we did end up producing a critical digital edition. To begin our work, we started by crowdsourcing the appearances of the poems that were published in the Harlem Shadows collection in 1922. We relied on bibliographies of McKay's work, and we found microfilm versions of the periodicals where McKay had published the original versions. As we did, we discovered significantly more variations between the originally published versions of the poems and those that were collected into the published version of Harlem Shadows, with the introduction and the editing by writer and political activist Max Eastman. This raised a crucial question for us of how our edition could prompt readers to explore the editorial interventions of white patrons of the Harlem Renaissance. Because we decided that in order to help users explore this question, we needed to include textual variants. We decided to use the TEI guidelines to digitize Harlem Shadows. So TEI, or the Text Encoding Initiative, was founded in 1987 and develops guidelines for marking up texts with tags that make them machine readable. So you can see examples here. So TEI tags look similar to HTML tags. They start with an open bracket, and there's a word, and there's a close bracket, and then it's bookended by a closing tag that begins with a backslash. And what TEI encloses are elements that indicate particular features of a text, like stanza breaks, underlining, you could do italics, deletions, additions, particularly if you're working with manuscripts. This is very, very useful and very helpful. The description between TEI elements and HTML, however, is that TEI elements are simply descriptive and do not function as operators. So if you put a letter B between an open bracket and a closed bracket, and then you write a word, and then you have a closed tag with a letter B in it, so open bracket, backslash B, closed bracket, on a web page, that will render text in bold. But TEI tags are semantic. They don't function. They don't actually do that. So to render the TEI marked up text, transform this edition into something that could be viewed in a readable format, like you can see here in a web browser, we ended up using XSLT style sheets to render the TEI file, HTML, web browsers, and you can see a very readable format online. We were also able to build in features into the edition that would toggle the textual variants on and off. So you can see that here in red. So if people want to explore the variants, they can, but if they don't want to, they can just turn it off. And given our interest in the pedagogical value of the edition, we also put in some editorial notes. There aren't really that many on this poem, but some of them have more. With the idea that we could gloss terms with which student readers might be unfamiliar. And then again, they can turn it on and off. And in the left-hand sidebars, we also included the textual history of the poem's periodical appearances and have also generated PDF and plain text versions of the poems. People want to download them. They can also download the TEI version. The primary challenge of this project was the time and labor intensive nature of the work, which is one clear limit to scaling up a project like this. Like we had imagined was possible, and it's totally not possible. Indeed, time and labor are a limit to digital cultural recovery. We had originally anticipated that we could design a workflow to efficiently create digital editions of public domain texts, but that was a complete fantasy. We were grad students, we learned. But that raised for me a question of what kinds of alternative approaches for creating editions might simultaneously meet the goal of producing high quality, well-edited digital editions, but do so in a manageable way. Now we know nothing can really speed up the time it takes to undertake good editing, but the use of TEI on the technical side does add a significant time and labor demand. I go back and forth on the value of TEI, but the most clear articulation of its value for me was made by Elisa Bashiro-Bandar, who agreed to be part of an interview for the Data Sitters Club, which is a digital humanities project that I'm part of. And we experiment with textual analysis tools and methods using a corpus of the Babysitters Club books, which is a preteen series. And if you're of a certain age, like those of us who are part of this project are, you may have read these books, but they're 12 and 13-year-olds who babysit, and there's a lot of books. And so in our book, The DSC and the Impossible TEI Quandaries, Katya Bowers and I interviewed Bashiro-Bandar, and I tormented her about the value of TEI. And she won me over with this observation. It's highlighted in blue. She said, when you've created a TEI document, you have made yourself a beautiful data storage chest. You can reach into every structural thing you have marked up. You can query it, and out of queries, you can create new kinds of documents. To me, just presenting a TEI digital edition is boring. I want to reach in and find out how many times Mr. X is represented in connection with two particular cities. And I can get a count of how many times that happens. I can plot it on a graph. I can make a network graph. I can extract data and make really cool visualizations. If my markup is thorough, I can do fine grain analysis. So I think there is a value, despite the time and labor intensiveness. But I think there are also other approaches we can take to digital editions. And the question of what that might look like was answered for me in part when Amardeep Singh and Ed Whiteley of Lehigh University and their students decided to explore and reimagine the Harlem Shadows project as Harlem Echoes. And in Harlem Echoes, they created their own edition built on a WordPress website Unlike Harlem Shadows, they tag the poems thematically so that it offers thinking about the user and what is the user's point of entry in the poem. How do you imagine something different than here's a table of contents, go through the poems? They tagged sun sexuality, gender, and race. They also decided to create short contextual essays, like various contexts for If We Must Die, very famous McKay poem. And then also interpretive short essays to go along with that as well. And so while something like Harlem Echoes lacks the machine readability provided by a TI edition, it offers a different kind of reading experience for a different kind of audience. And I want to kind of keep that in mind, right? What is the right decision to make around editing, around digital edition production for this particular kinds of audiences that we want to reach? An alternative approach to creating digital editions is the minimal edition. Edward Van Hoot defines the minimal edition as a cultural product that is produced by the scholarly editor acting as a curator or guardian of the text. The minimal edition, according to Van Hoot, stands in contrast to the maximal edition, or an academic product in which the scholarly editor demonstrates scholarly accuracy and scrutiny. And there's a bit of a false binary here, in which I would argue that actually minimal editions can be equally as concerned with scholarly accuracy as maximal editions, but that they're designed for different audiences. With the minimal edition, the editor is beholden to scholarly accuracy and scrutiny, and the onus does lie on the editor to provide a rationale that makes their editorial choices legible, but they prioritize a different kind of legibility of the text for audiences that are perhaps less concerned with digging into textual witnesses, but instead having a text that is more readily usable for reading audiences. In Harlem Shadows, for example, we tried to hit that balance between maximal and minimal with representation of textual variants through the toggle, but also the opportunity to read without them, particularly useful if somebody just wants a reliable edition to teach, which was where the project came from in the first place. One approach to minimal editions is using Alex Hill's theme Ed, which is a theme for the static site generator Jekyll. And Ed is focused on legibility, durability, ease, and flexibility, with the goal of producing beautifully rendered scholarly or reading editions of texts meant to last. And here's a really wonderful example of an edition of Aimé Césaire's play Et les chiens se taisent, created by Hill using Ed. And by making Ed available for public use, he raises an important point for those who are editing to consider, which is under what circumstances is the maximal edition, such as those that use TEI or focus on building out really complex critical apparatus, beneficial for producing an edition of a text, and when is a minimal edition the appropriate choice? These are the kinds of issues that Carol Stabile and I were contemplating when we created Reanimate, an intersectional feminist publishing collective. The idea for Reanimate emerged when Carol, Dr. Stabile, was finishing her work on the Broadcast 41, Women and the Anti-Communist Blacklist. When the Cold War era began, 41 women working in TV and radio were placed on a media blacklist and were forced out of the industry for their so-called communist influence. Stabile's book argues that these women, by nature of their diversity and their ambition, were less purveyors of communist propaganda than women who threatened traditional portrayals of US life on television and in radio, both for their failure to hew to gender roles and for their involvement in civil rights. And Stabile tells the story of how these women in media industries sought to depict the US as diverse and complicated and inclusive, and uses archival research on these women's writing to imagine what television media might look like if their perspectives hadn't been suppressed. And she proposes that 1950s Leave It to Beaver, all white, male-dominated version of the US that even today plays a crucial role in right-wing nostalgia was only possible through the blacklisting of these women. So while she was writing the book, Dr. Stabile discovered a treasure trove of archival materials, both unpublished writing and published work that's been ignored, that's out of print by these women. And she wanted to create a companion edition to publish this work, and she had secured the rights to do so. But when she approached presses with the idea of producing a volume of writing on women that most people haven't heard of, the press's response was to raise their concern over a market for the volume. And this is the catch-22 of writing by women and by others from marginalized identities, our very erasure from the cultural record, from dominant narratives of culture, in turn then become justification for continued erasure under the logic that we are unknown and therefore we are unmarketable. So it's like, how do we find our way out of that bind? And that's one of the concerns that we've been thinking through with this project. So Dr. Stabile told me about the challenges she was encountering with the presses, and my response was, let's just create some open access digital editions. And that's how Reanimate was born. Media and communication studies in particular have been quite slow to address the absence of women and people of color in their canons of knowledge, both as influential figures in industries and as critics and scholars of mass media. In terms of contributions to media industries, the histories of women and people of color are only really starting to be told when looking at the 20th century. And the approach to these media histories has actually been one of the great figure, the already well-known figure who, despite enormous odds, has managed to leave their imprint on industries. And unfortunately, this means that there are so many who aren't becoming part of that history. So our task was clear. We would try to make these women's writing available online in an open access format with the goal of reanimating the histories of cultural studies and media studies with unheard voices, and think about how we might develop a model or a template for other groups engaged in their own projects of recovery. In developing Reanimate, we were preoccupied with a series of questions because we weren't viewing the project as simply an intervention in representation. Let's add these voices, to the digital cultural record, but then also this question of how do we do this work ethically? And the questions that guide our work are the following. So what does an intersectional feminist workflow for scholarly communication look like? So for us, this has meant that mentorship of future scholars and focusing on reciprocity is crucial to this work. And I'll talk through one of our examples and explain how this looks like in practice in a minute. What does it mean to design an open access labor model based on our commitment to freely sharing materials as an alternative to costly journals, monographs, and textbooks? So for us, this has meant thinking through partnerships, and we have a number of partners like the University of Minnesota Press, who provided access to and support for a publishing platform, and specifically wanting to only work with partners who share our values. What would a financial model based on these principles look like? For us, this means there is no free labor on this project except by Dr. Stabile and I, but we're tenured faculty members, so we get paid. So everybody, there's no appeal to experience as compensation. Anybody who works on it gets paid and they get credited in our editorial workflow, even though this means we're moving more slowly than we would like due to financial constraints. And finally, how can the workflow, labor deployment, and financial model be self-sustaining while maintaining a commitment to open access publication? So for us, this means thinking about how we might, when we have more editions, offer instructors the opportunity to remix materials into a very cheap course pack offered through print on demand or through subscription just for those remix packs. So everything else still remain open access, but it could be sort of easily packaged for teaching, and maybe see if that could contribute to a break-even model. But that's sort of a next year kind of development. We are still answering these questions as we develop the editions in Reanimate. We've been fortunate to be part of the Manifold pilot at the University of Minnesota Press, which has allowed us to use the Manifold open access publishing platform for our editions. Each edition sources, edits, curates, and transcribes writing by one of the women in media who are trying to recover. Each edition is accompanied by a series editor introduction written by Stabile, me, and typically a paid graduate research assistant who we mentor through the process. We also invite scholars who have written on the figures to write the scholars introduction. So currently we have 3 editions in our pipeline. The first one is, you can see part of it here. The first is the Freddie Washington Reader. For this one, we sourced, transcribed, and edited all columns by Black actress Freddie Washington, who wrote for the People's Voice, a Black newspaper in Harlem in the 1940s that was edited by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And in her columns, Washington offers a really powerful look at race and politics and culture in the theater industry in New York primarily. And we've completed the edition and we're awaiting receipt of the Scholars Introduction by Laurie Woodard, who's writing a biography of Washington. And so in exchange for writing the introduction, we provided Woodard with access to the edition a long time ago, like a year ago, to assist with her research. So this is an example of the kind of reciprocity that I'm talking about that we're trying to build into our publication model. For the Washington Reader, we were also able to bring in paid high school students to assist with transcription, which gave them the opportunity to learn about Washington as well as gain editorial experience. And this is the kind of mentorship of future scholars and working with graduate research assistants as well that we see as part of the intersectional feminist workflow. And Dr. Stabile and I sort of maintain the oversight and integrity over the editing process. We have 2 more editions that are nearly ready for publication. One is the memoir of a white film actress named Jean Muir, who was the first performer to be blacklisted after her name appeared in an anti-communist pamphlet called Red Channels that came out in 1950. Her crimes in Hollywood were manifold. She was involved in the formation of the Screen Actors Guild. So obviously very suspect. Labor organizing tendencies. She's also involved in the civil rights movement, which brought her under suspicion as well. And our other upcoming volume is the play Soldadera, about women revolutionaries in the Mexican-American War, written by a Mexican-American journalist, Josefina Nigli. She is little known, but her writing on Mexican-American issues in the mid-century would lay the groundwork for the rise of the Chicana movement. At the time, she was the first and only Mexican woman writing in English on Mexican themes, and her work helped pave the way for work of later writers like Gloria Anzaldúa. The volume on Soldadera is the result of work with our partners on Reanimate, the recovery project, the University of Houston, which is led by Gabriela Baeza Ventura and Carolina Villarreal. And they've been recovering US Latinx literary heritage through the acquisitions of newspapers and texts that shed light on the rich multilingual history of Latinx literary heritage. So we've been very fortunate to be working with them. So our project is aiming to give these writers a life beyond the blacklist and to envision the ways of expanding the voices of underrepresented writers and thinkers through the editions. I want to note that we've come to this project a bit wary of sounding techno-utopian, like creating open access editions will solve the problems of inequities in the digital cultural record. The time and labor of creating editions with scholarly integrity means that our work is necessarily slow. And our desire to ensure that everyone who works on the project is both compensated and mentored means that we're reliant on getting funding from our institutions for students to work with us. And we're able to usually get about 1 a year because we work at public universities with financial constraints. And there's also the fact that for every writer whose work we can locate and can integrate into the project, the work of digital cultural recovery is always limited by the power dynamics that shape archives in the first place. And that for all the work that we can do to recover some voices, there are many whose work is simply unrecoverable. But I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. The first is the importance to the many forms that a digital edition may take. From the extensive, robust TEI maximal edition to the lightweight minimal edition and everything in between. What our audiences need should be the guiding principle. We need all kinds of editions for all kinds of audiences. The edition we would create to offer, say, the high school teachers I work with at Salem State, to offer them new texts to teach, is not the edition that we need to offer the book historian. And we need to stop valorizing the latter over the former. The more diversity in form that we embrace for the digital edition, the more audiences we could reach, and the more voices we'll be able to ensure can be heard in the digital cultural record. The second is the importance of changing the ways that our scholarly evaluations of digital editions are undertaken. Recently, I had the experience of reviewing the wonderful project Livingston Online for the Modern Language Association's Seal of Scholarly Editions. Livingston Online is directed by Adrian Wisnicki and Megan Ward, an excellent digital collection on colonialist explorer David Livingstone, and based on everything I've said in this talk, should be exactly like the project, exactly the kind of project I have serious issues with. Great man, narrative of a colonizer. But what Wisnicki and Ward have actually done is, in their revamp of this project, is take seriously what it means and the ethical complications of creating a digital edition of a colonizer, and have brought in additional texts and additional voices to really complicate the narrative and to decenter him as much as possible. It works out. They do it quite successfully. But when I reviewed the edition for the Modern Language Association, the guidelines for review that I was given reward not what is actually most valuable about the project, but the most conservative approaches to textual editing possible, and to textual editing in print, not in digital editions. And it turns out the committee asked me to review it because they wanted me to point out these problems, which was very nice. They wanted someone other than themselves to be saying there are problems with these review criteria, problems with the ways that digital editions are adjudicated. And so my hope is that, having given that feedback, and more crucially, the work of recent membership of that committee, like Amy Earhart, Susan Brown, and Catherine Harris, will open up the ways that digital editions are evaluated, to create space for recognition that what it means to create a scholarly edition, a scholarly digital edition, is actually more expansive than what is imagined in the criteria currently. And there can be new models, and we can articulate what these look like. And finally, I just want to reiterate the importance of resisting the idea of the self-evident value of canonical voices. I alluded to this in the origin story of Reanimate, where Dr. Stabile couldn't find a publisher to create an edition of writing by women no one had heard of because no one had heard of them. We see similar trends in grant funding, where those of us who work on lesser known or unknown figures have the burden of proving their value, while projects on William Blake and Walt Whitman continue to get lots of research funding. This disproportionately affects representation of women and people with marginalized identities. And when we are continually denied by publishers or rejected by grant makers, this exacerbates these inequities. No one is ever going to learn about them if we are not given opportunities to make their work known, justified by the fact that they are unknown. Instead, we might consider reframing value as one in which diversity and the unknown voices who could create that diversity is inherently valuable, precisely because it offers perspectives that have hitherto gone unexamined. What I'm proposing is an uphill battle for sure. Canons were built in a day. They're certainly not going to be undone in one keynote. But as people invested in the future of the editing and the future of the edition, this is our challenge and this is our responsibility. And if we rise to it, then we have a crucial role to play in the expansion of the digital cultural record. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Roopika. That was a wonderful talk. I do have a question from our participant. The question and comment is, wonderful talk. I'm wondering if there was a particular reason to cite Kirschenbaum coding in McGann instead of looking to Nowitzki, McPherson, Smith, Flanders about textual editing very, very early on, who were asking questions about missing voices 30 to 40 years ago, and are often not cited in favor of citing Kirschenbaum and McGann. Earhart is incredible, but I'm wondering if there's something specific about not speaking to these early women who took major risks early on.
Oh, no, not at all. I have, published in my writing, I cite them all the time. I was trying to think about how to frame this and how to frame this particular work that I wanted to talk about in relation to my book. And that's really the bridge for me. I do cite their work actually all the time.
If anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat and I will pass them on. I do, in doing some research in preparation for your talk, I see that you're also interested in issues of sustainability and how institutions can assist with that. And I'm curious if you can say a bit more about that as we think about both the technologies that we're making use of and the partnerships and collaborations that we're building. The importance, I think, of sustainability, as technologies come and go, and the carefully edited content still exists. What should we be thinking about in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I really think about is actually the format in which we're maintaining the data. Because if we're thinking about portable formats, if we're thinking about flat file formats, then we can always put it somewhere else. That was actually, when we were deciding what platform to use for Reanimate, this was something we kept talking about, because I mean, we could have used Ed. We could, which actually would have been fine. We could have used, we were talking to PubPub, which is a platform that actually used for reviews in digital humanities, a journal I run. That's from MIT Knowledge Futures Group. And we thought about, and we were looking at Manifold. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we thought the files would be most usable if they were just plain text markdown files. And that was Manifold was a platform that allowed for ingestion of those. And that was really like the decision we made, because that way we always have those files. They're forever as anything is. And therefore we would be able to just take them and put them somewhere else and use them on another platform very, very easily.
Yeah, that's super important. And, as I think we all think about this at our own projects, the issues of standards come up, standardizing semantic data, metadata, creating taxonomies and ontologies that are then shared with the community so that, and this is really sort of lends itself to long-term discoverability if they're stored in a way that where access can be given based on these things. And I'm curious, you've worked with so many different projects, and this can be a problem when you're sort of working thematically or chronologically, but still there are differences. How do you approach that so that there could be maybe shared infrastructure or some shared vocabularies that kind of provide this long-term accessibility that we're talking about?
Can you rephrase that question a little bit, if possible?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about, I think I probably asked several questions in one question, but this idea of sharing, and I say standards, but what I mean, I think, is shared language that we use to describe content, so metadata, vocabularies and things like that, things that provide access points regardless of platform, things that we can all make use of, so that down the road this content remains discoverable.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done much with this, but I think linked open data is super useful in this regard. I think, for example, the Orlando project out of that Susan Brown has done a lot of work on, and she's at the University of Guelph, I believe. And so that's, I think, particularly in terms of like linked open data in terms of feminist ontologies, I think that her work that work out of that lab, it's not just her, there's a lot of people there, is really, really crucial. We had a great example of using linked open data with Wikidata in reviews in digital humanities. We reviewed, it's a journal that reviews digital humanities projects, and we reviewed an authority list for the names of Jewish ghettos during World War II. And so it was an authority list attempting to address the sort of challenge of transliteration and different names that are all or historical and place names and contemporary place names. And so I think there's a lot of possibility for linked open data here.
Yeah, I think that's right. You also brought up, I think, this idea of valuing digital work. And I know that, when I teach digital editing, a lot of folks who are coming through are, professors that are doing this for a variety of reasons. But a concern that always comes up is whether this is going to count the same as something that's print. And I know that scholarly organizations are aware of this, and they're trying to, I think, work at this, think about the MLA with, the standards for review and things like that. But I'm curious if you have thoughts on that. I'm sure you do, but obviously this is intellectual work. This is important work. And, I think it allows entry points for those who are, maybe just students as well as professors. And so I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, so I mean, this is part of the reason that Jennifer Giuliano and I created Reviews in Digital Humanities, is that we realized that even though various organizations like MLA and A had developed guidelines for evaluating digital scholarship, it didn't mean that people actually use the guidelines for evaluating digital scholarship. I was actually really lucky that in my tenure letters, one of my writers actually went through the guidelines of the MLA and with one of my projects, and they said, her projects do this. Here's an example of one of them, and went systematically through the guidelines. But I mean, how many people are fortunate enough to get a writer who happens to be a digital humanist, who happens to be attuned to these issues, who knows they need to do that in order to show the value of digital scholarship? Because in every review I'd had until then, it was like my digital scholarship didn't exist and everybody was only focused on the print scholarship. So Dr. Giuliano and I decided, you know what, especially after our experiences running several conferences, digital humanities conferences, we felt like there was very little consensus on how to review projects. And the lack of peer review is often stated as one of the problems and deterrents to being able to value digital scholarship, right? Because somebody hasn't put the imprimatur of the peer on it. That's not it, though. I mean, a lot of it is around needing to reorient and change the way humanities colleagues understand what scholarship is. That scholarship, well, I mean, at the very basic and obvious level, it doesn't have to be a journal article, it doesn't have to be a monograph. But then getting to slightly more complicated, like public is not bad, public is a good thing, right? It's not inherently valuable because your library has to subscribe to it in order for someone to read it. It's not inherently valuable because it's written by one person. That collaboration is inherently valuable as well. And so these are the kinds of pieces that we need to address. One way that we've tried to address this in relation to not just digital humanities scholarship, but forms of scholarship that are, one could say, non-traditional. At my university and we're unionized. And so when we last negotiated a contract, we had because more expansive notions of genres of scholarship written into the contract. It was something our administration was supportive of. And so, but I mean, again, having those in there didn't mean that people knew how to use them. So we actually ended up having to do a year of training of how do you use these new contract guidelines, both as a person going up for promotion or tenure or reappointment and as an evaluator. So there's that piece of this, but also really at the basic level. And I mean, I think I sound fairly combative when I say this. I say this is so now an integral part of our disciplines that if you have not, as a colleague who doesn't do this work, taken it upon yourself to learn something about it and what to do with it, then you are shirking your professional responsibility.
Thank you. The next comment has to do with reconceptualizing the digital edition, which I think is necessary and very timely. I love the way you connected the observation about the many forms that digital editions can take and the benefit of creating editions with specific users, audiences in mind. What advice would you have for new edition project developers and how they can engage likely users at the early project consumption stage?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, one of the things is we spent about a year just conceptualizing what we were going to do with Reanimate in the first place, because we were sort of thinking, one of our areas of interest is actually high school teachers who want to sort of diversify the voices that they're teaching in their courses. And so I was very fortunate in that I'm partially in School of Education. And so we had a lot of access to people to ask them, if you're teaching, what would be most beneficial to you? What would be useful? What kind of formats? How would you want your students to be able to access the text? I mean, it was really just asking the potential user community about what they would like. We didn't do this in a very formal way, but one could do this in a very formal way as well. And so, I mean, I think that that's the challenge. I mean, the inherent trade-off of not just doing something that looks like every other edition is that then when you're dealing with the scholarly community, you might then run into people who are saying, well, that's not a digital edition. So that's, I mean, I think that that's a very real challenge. I think the fact that we did this, I was almost had tenure in Carol's full, Dr. Stabile's full, she's actually like a dean now. We were really in a position where we could say we can do this project because we want to do it, and we want to do it like this without really worrying about what that meant in terms of evaluation, because we were in a position of privilege in relation to that. So, I mean, I think there's also a balance to be struck between kind of fully going with what you want because the user base demands it, and that's what they want, and that's what's most beneficial, and also thinking about where that fits into your professional trajectory more broadly, and kind of what's the right move to make that the project will be helping you with your goals and what you hope to achieve, which, I'm not implying that necessarily has to mean tenure. I mean, so many people do this work outside of tenure track jobs. So.
You also mentioned working with high school students. They did transcription work. You collaborated with them on that. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more. I think it's a really great idea to involve folks from an early age in this work so they gain an appreciation of the humanities. But I think there's something about actually doing the work that really, that level of engagement that's so important. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was really ad hoc. That was sort of like, I have money and I need some work done, and how can we find some people who will do the work, and we will like teach them about editing. So it wasn't very systematic and structured in any kind of way. It was sort of like, let us teach you about editing, and let us teach you about working with newspapers from the 1940s, things like that. I've had more structured experiences, not with digital editions, but with digital exhibits and with digital archives with high school students. So I've done, for example, I've run co-taught capstone senior course for high school seniors with a teacher at a local school. And in that case, it sort of happened that I was really interested in this question of what would happen, how do we build up a pipeline of students who are going to be interested in going into careers in archives and libraries and digital humanities, and how do we do that at a younger age? And so I had a relationship with a school because I had sent some of my teachers there to teach, and they liked them. And so they were really excited about potentially working together. And so we, I met with the principal, I met with the English teacher who was interested, and we developed a course that we would co-teach based on kind of where her goals for her students. I mean, she had a group of students who, it looked like they might not pass, they might not graduate. And so often these are the kinds of opportunities that go to the most, elite students in a school, but we went total opposite direction to the students who are sort of most at risk of not finishing high school. And so we would bring them into Salem State, into the archives, like teach them about archives, teach them how to use, we were using Omeka, so taught them how to use Omeka, how to do secondary source research. And, they all graduated from high school and 7 of them came to Salem State. So it was also an unintentional recruiting tool. And when we started the class, we asked how many of them were considering Salem State, and it was 0. Wow. So that was kind of fun. So I think it's really crucial to start introducing students to this work early. And, in Massachusetts, we have these digital literacy standards that were introduced in 2016, because finally someone realized that our students come to college and have very low technical proficiency. Because I think for, a long time they thought, well, they have cell phones, so they know how to use technology, which is totally not a correlation at all. And so we have these standards, but the state hasn't done any professional development around them whatsoever. They're supposed to be integrated across the curriculum in every discipline, but nobody has told anybody how. So we've tried to play a role, particularly in our School of Education, and how do we use digital humanities for that in English language arts and social studies?
Right. That's really great. Thank you. Just have one more question. Of course, there are folks who are just starting off with projects, but there are those of us who have been with projects that have been going on for quite some time. And so I'm curious, as we think about how to do our work sort of more responsibly or in a more representative way, do you have any advice for those of us who are currently contemplating these questions about how we can do a better job?
Yeah, I think the main advice is think about who your team is, think about who is and isn't represented on your team. I think, oftentimes the biggest challenge is that, people have particular perspectives on who's an expert and who's not an expert. And, if you try and think about, particularly if you're doing work that involves communities who are near your university, right? How do you build relationships with them, find ways to bring them in on a project, find ways to compensate them for being part of a project, and to really think about who you're collaborating with.
Well, thank you. I think we're getting a message here that we're just about out of time. And I think it looks like we're out of questions and comments. So I want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon and for your address. It certainly leaves us all with some things to think about. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing everybody else in sessions later this afternoon and on every Tuesday this month. So
thank you.
Great.